Colleagues, once again, welcome to yet another Rodney seminar. My name is Mike Wildemar, I'm Director of the African Studies Center. We're really, again, excited to have a really fantastic guest, Madina Thiam, who is joining us from UCLA. She's a Ph.D. candidate there and a 2021 Mellon ACLS Dissertation Completion Fellow, and also an incoming assistant professor at Drexel University in History and Africana Studies. So she'll be in Philadelphia soon if she's not already there. And her work does really interesting work, explores the circulations of West African people and ideas, social histories of Islam in Mali, race making in the Sahel, Malian women's histories, and Pan-African decolonization. She also helps organize a Bamako-based digitization project, creating a public archive of papers of Malian women involved in the movement for independence and post-colonial feminist activism, which sounds really interesting. She's published her work in a wide variety of venues, Oxford Research Encyclopedia of African History, the Codesria Bulletin, which I think many of you know, and Islamic Africa, among others. So we're really, really excited to hear about your work, Madina, and I'll turn it over to you with that introduction. And so we'll give you about 40 minutes to discuss some of your work, and then we'll get into a Q&A, which I'll moderate. So thanks again.
All right, can everybody hear me fine? Okay, great. Well, thank a lot, Michael, for the introduction. Very nice introduction. And thank you for the invitation. Thank you for Eric Schmidt for inviting me and organizing all of this, the African Studies Center at Boston University. And thank you very much to everyone for taking the time out to attend. I'm seeing a number of people that I know or that I've read or from, whose scholarship I've benefited from. So it's very excited to have everybody in this room. So yeah, I'm really honored to share this forum with you all and excited to share some of my work. So today I'm going to talk about a section of one of my dissertation chapters, which is about the story of Bakr Siddiq Ouattara, who was a man who was born in Timbuktu in the late 18th century, enslaved in Jamaica for 30 years, obtained his manumission, and then undertook a journey across the Atlantic Ocean and the Sahara Desert to return home. I want to think about what it meant and what it entailed for him to seek freedom in a world, his world, that was shaped both by the transatlantic slavery in the Caribbean, the trans-Saharan slave trade in North Africa, as well as 19th century revolutions and state building in the West African Sahel. These are all spheres that I've been very interested in, but that I tended to have a very partitioned understanding of. Yet you encounter some historical characters who within their lifetime and within their own worldviews, for whom these spheres were very much braided together. And Bakr Siddiq Ouattara is one of them. So let me share my screen. There it is. So this is the outline for today's talk, which is entitled Seeking Freedom in the Sahel, Bakr Siddiq Ouattara's Journey Through Slavery and Race Making, 1834-1836. First, I'm going to go over how he was able to obtain manumission in Jamaica and become legally free, at least in the sense that the British understood it in 1834 in Jamaica. Then I will discuss his travel over to the Maghreb and the racial slavery that he encountered there. Then we will go south and move on to notions around Blackness and enslavability in the Sahel as they were being laid out by some of the state makers that were kind of like revolutionizing politics and society in the region as the time Ouattara was seeking to get back to the region. Finally, we'll cover information networks crisscrossing the Sahara, crisscrossing Northwest Africa, that he was able to sort of tap into for his freedom project. And then we'll open it up for some conclusions and some discussion. And as I said, this is part of one of my dissertation chapter, and so I'll be very happy to hear everybody's comments, suggestions, and whatnot. So let me start this story on September 9th, 1834, in Kingston, Jamaica, where a thick crowd filled the public office of Judge Richard Robert Madden. They had gathered to witness landowner Alexander Anderson's manumission of Edward Dulin, a man he lawfully owned. As the proceedings began, emotions were running high in the room. The judge noted that Black and white attendees alike were deeply moved, some even shedding tears. Eventually, Dulin, the enslaved man, and Madden, the judge, proceeded to sign the bottom of the manumission certificate, sealing Alexander Anderson's renouncement of his ownership rights. The document declared Edward Dulin, I quote, absolutely and utterly free to all intents and purposes. And I will show you this document in a second, but first a quick biographical sketch. Edward Dulin's real name, the one he bore prior to his enslavement, was Bakr As-Siddiq Ouattara. He was born around the year 1790 in Timbuktu. He grew up in Djenné and was educated in Bounam. And all these cities are in what we might call today the West African Sahel, in today's Mali and northern Côte d'Ivoire. And these cities were known as cosmopolitan centers of Muslim education and intellectual production. Ouattara was Jula from the Mandinka trading people of West Africa, Muslim and literate in the Arabic script. And as he was undergoing schooling and in the midst of his preparations to go on Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca and Medina, that he was kidnapped, taken to the Atlantic coast and forced into a British ship that carried him to Jamaica. He would have been around 15 years old when he arrived in the Caribbean in 1805, and he remained enslaved there for 29 years. In Kingston, Ouattara was known to keep accounting records in Jamaican Creole written in the Arabic script, which had been his language of instruction and worship as he was growing up in West Africa. After 3 decades of enslavement, he met Richard Madden, who was an Irish judge who had been sent to Jamaica on behalf of the British Crown to oversee the application of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833. They developed a close and inevitably unequal, of course, relationship through which Ouattara wrote an autobiographical document detailing his upbringing and his life up to his enslavement. Madden also pushed for the man who was enslaving Ouattara to agree to sign his freedom papers, his freedom certificate. And so here it is. This document, apologies for the poor quality of the screenshot. This document is currently held at the Jamaica Archives and Record Department in Spanish Town. And so on the, oops, sorry, let me get back to it. You get to have a preview of the whole presentation. There it is. So you see on the left-hand side of the document, this mention Anderson to Dulin Edward, known before his baptism by the name of Abu Bakr, certificate of release from apprenticeship. It was established in October 1834. You have the main text of the document that lays out the conditions under which Abu Bakr is being released from apprenticeship. So apprenticeship was the mandatory period that was that the British enforced in Jamaica after the formal abolition of slavery, whereby the enslaved were not quite free, but they were not quite enslaved, even though for all intents and purposes, their condition was still very much akin to slavery. So Abu Bakr is being released from that. And you see that the document is signed, so on the bottom right side by Richard Robert Madden, who is the judge charged with overseeing the end of slavery. And on the left side by Abu Bakr Ouattara himself, who signs with his name, wa ismi Abu Bakr al-Siddiq, and you see him signing twice at the bottom in Arabic letters at the bottom of the document. So we have a few sources that tell us about Ouattara's life. There's this document and other primary sources from the 19th century. You have the autobiographical document that Ouattara wrote, which I mentioned. There is also his correspondence with another enslaved Black Muslim man on the island, named Mohamed Kaba Saranogo. And there are also the writings of John Davidson, who was the English traveler whom Ouattara traveled with from London back to Africa, to the Maghreb. There are also secondary sources. A number of authors have actually written about Ouattara. His story has been analyzed in a number of scholarly works by Ivor Wilkes, Alan Austin, Sylvian Diouf, Michael Gomez, Paul Lovejoy and Yacinda Diadoun have also done some work on this. More recently, Elia Khan. And so their work has used Ouattara's story to shed light on either the retention of African culture among enslaved Black people in the Americas, and including within African culture, there's these literary and scriptural traditions, or to shed light on the West African sort of scholarly and trading network that Ouattara's family was part of on the continent. What I want to do today is take a slightly different focus and examine a different aspect of his story, that is what happens after that document is drawn when he decides to return to Africa. I'm interested in the changes that he would have encountered after 30 years of enslavement, particularly the significant of evolving meanings of racial slavery in the Sahara and in the Sahel that were occurring precisely at the time Ouattara was attempting to return home. And that would have had a significant bearing on his aspirations, right? Like how does a man who was sort of immersed in the realm of British Caribbean slavery encounter and navigate racial slavery in the Sahara and political changes in the Sahel in the 1830s? And what meanings of freedom could he come up with, or could he realistically aspire to in these very different contexts? So that's what we're going to discuss in the next part on racial slavery in the Maghreb. Pardon my poor graphic design skills. I butchered this map a little bit to show a very rough representation of the journey that Ouattara undertakes in 1835. So after the manumission ceremony, and at Ouattara's request, Madden, the judge, writes to the Royal Geographical Society of London to have him hired as a guide to Timbuktu. The society denies Ouattara's application on the basis that he has been away from West Africa for too long and wouldn't be too helpful a guide. But despite the rejection, he perseveres, and he's eventually able to embark from Kingston to London, where he arrives in 1835 and manages to get hired as a guide for a private expedition led by an English explorer by the name of John Davidson, who was seeking to reach Timbuktu, like many Europeans at the time. Ouattara and Davidson left London, and following an 8-day sail, they disembarked in Gibraltar, where they remained for 2 months before crossing the strait to Tangiers. And then they proceeded south across Morocco through various towns, eventually reaching the bustling market town of Guelmim in southern Morocco. And so briefly, but by the time Ouattara arrives in Morocco in late 1835, the violence of racial slavery and the pervasive stigma of Blackness's association with slave status are very much present. Slavery had been an established practice in the region, and although Islamic law forbade the enslavement of free Muslims, as the work of Shouki el-Hamel and other people shows, Moroccan rulers renegotiated these legal prescriptions to try and maintain the Southern Sahara, including its Black Muslim populations, as a labor reservoir. From the 16th century onwards, you see a shift, a de facto, whereby the de facto threshold used to determine if a person could be legally enslaved incrementally shifted from whether or not they were Muslim to whether or not they were Black. And so as a result, Ouattara's very first experience of Africa upon his return would have made plain to him how his own freedom, legally secured in the British Atlantic, remained feeble in the Sahara. And I mean, it would have remained feeble in Jamaica too, but that's another part of the story that we can discuss later. Particularly his 6-month stay in the desert town of Guelmim, where the expedition arrived in late April 1836 would have been plain the magnitude and the violence of the trans-Saharan slave trade. Indeed, in the first decades of the 19th century, the centuries-old Saharan trade was at its apex, and the city of Gelmim, nicknamed Bab al-Sahra, the door of the Sahara, was one of its hubs. Why? By the 1830s, the dwindling Atlantic slave trade, the increasing commodities exchange between West Africa and Western Europe, and also Sahelian conflicts triggering widespread insecurity and population displacements, these three factors had all led to a spike in the volume of the transcontinental and trans-Saharan trade in goods and enslaved Black Africans. What's more, the 1830 French colonial invasion of Algeria redirected a large volume of caravan trade towards Timbuktu, towards Morocco, or towards Libya. And so the city of Gelmim, which had long been a caravan hub, became one of the largest, actually the largest camel market in Northwest Africa by the 19th century, and one of the region's main slave markets. And so it was on a Friday, April 22nd, 1836, that Ouattara and his party reached that town of Gelmim. It was in the time of the year that would have marked the close of caravan season and the beginning of the spring slave fairs. They would end up staying there until the end of that year. When they arrived, they were greeted by their host, the chief of the Tikna Confederacy, Sheikh Barouk, whose house, and that's a quote from Davidson, his house swarmed with slaves who form a very large item of property, which made Ouattara feel, quote, very helpless, end of quote. There were countless violent scenes and encounters that were recorded in Davidson's travels notes. Sheikh Barouk, for example, owned 40 female slaves, and he subjected many to rape and fathered numerous children. There was another example later that year where Sheikh Barouk captured a fugitive man and had him chained with a 56-pound weight fastened to his leg and left in the sun for at least 2 days without water. Later that month, Ouattara witnessed a caravan arriving carrying gold, cloth, and 20 slaves from West Africa. And he claimed that these people were from the neighborhood of the place where his family resided. The next day, 6 women from that group were examined, apprised, and sold at the market, including one who had given birth during the Saharan crossing, so on and so forth. You see a lot such examples of what Ouattara witnessed. And so his time in Gelmim would indeed have re-immersed him into a world of publicly displayed corporeal and sexual violence inflicted upon Black women, men, and children, constant reaffirmation of their enslaved status, and likely his own vulnerability to racial slavery. But spending time in Gelmim also did something else, something significant. It allowed him to become part of information networks that spread across Northwest Africa. And through these networks, which carried news of social political upheaval throughout the Western Sahel and the Sahara, Ouattara learned of monumental changes that were underway in his native region and that might also affect his project of return. And so let's switch gears and head south to the floodplains of the inner Niger River Delta. So this is like the central region of what is today Mali. And there in the 1830s, right as Ouattara was waiting to cross the desert, the leaders of a new hegemonic state were reconfiguring slavery and manufacturing race through Islamic discourse. Who are these people, these new leaders of this new state? In 1818, they had successfully led a revolution. Amadou Lobo, a disenfranchised Fulani Muslim scholar, started an uprising that subdued regional political and intellectual elites, including in Djenné and in Timbuktu. The insurgents created a new state, a caliphate centered around the city of Hamdallah. And to consolidate the regional dominion, the caliphate leadership implemented a conventional arsenal of military, diplomatic, and economic expansion, and built a strong central administration. And they also employed a more original strategy. They crafted a forged historical chronicle named the Tarikh el-Fatash, the Researcher's Chronicle. What was this document? Essentially, it's a 19th century document claiming to be from the 17th century and to be looking out into the future to contain a prophecy that heralds the rise of this new caliphate of Hamdala'i and heralds the rise of its leader, Amadou Lobo. So this strategy, the strategy of crafting this forged document, it is very obvious, right? Why it's done. It's meant to legitimize their rule to the outside world. But why do we care? Why is this related to our concern about Ouattara and about race and slavery in the Sahel, in the Sahara, in the 19th century? Well, it's because in the remainder of the forged document, there were mentions that were devoted to a different purpose. Specifically, part of the document delved into social status in the Sahel, ascribing permanent hereditary slave status to some specific Sahelian communities. And to do that, the Hamdala'i leadership mobilized and blended discourse stemming from local or Fulani hierarchies on the one hand, but also Saharan Muslim racial discourse on the other hand. And this is shown by a variety of sources. You have oral sources in oral like Fulani sources, written sources in Arabic. And so I believe they did that. They employed these multiple registers to talk about enslavability, including some that contain racial discourse about Blackness, because they wanted to use a register that would be legible in the shared Islamic discourse of the 19th century Western Sahel and Sahara, which had become increasingly racialized. And there's the excellent work of Bruce Hall that shows these kind of processes that occur in the Sahel at the time. And so it was thus in the spirit that the Hamdala'i leaders, though themselves racialized as Black by fellow Muslim contemporaries, utilized racial terms denoting Blackness in the Arabic language, in the Songhai language, to designate some of the Sahelian communities that they sought to enslave. So this is tricky, right? Because Blackness is not merely related to phenotype here, but it's more tapping into these discourses that are throughout the Sahel and the Sahara that tend to equate Black with enslavable. But these were not merely rhetorical devices. They had also concrete real-life consequences, and entire Sahelian communities were enslaved or displaced on the basis of this racialized Islamic discourse emanating from West Africa. And this will carry on, continue and increase these processes of enslavement internally throughout the 19th century and the 20th century. And even up to today, there still are definitely strong remnants of that. The Hamdala'i authorities did not merely rewrite enslavability and race in the Niger Bend. They ensured that the news would spread as far and wide as possible by written word and word of mouth. The full chronicle that they wrote was stored in Hamdala'i's library, where people could come to consult and copy manuscripts. And the body of the text itself instructed whoever might come across it to disseminate its content with a specific injunction from the author, quote, "I urge and press all those who receive this letter of mine to make a copy of it and to send it to everybody who they think did not receive what is included in it. I also urge and press the courier of the letter to gather the Muslims of the towns, the villages and hamlets that he passes through and he thinks did not hear of it, to read this letter to them or inform them orally according to his capability," end of quote. And so the portion of the chronicle that contained these instructions around race and enslavability was circulated widely, making it, per Mauro Nobili's assessment, one of the most widespread documents in pre-colonial Islamic West Africa. And for those who would be interested in reading this primary source, I quickly glanced at the beginning of the talk and I saw that Ali Jakite was in the room, and I believe Dr. Jakite, Mauro Nobili, and Zachary Wright are currently working on a critical edition and translation into English of the Tarikh al-Fatah. So that's very exciting. Oh, and sorry, I forgot to show this slide earlier. This is a sort of a artistic representation of the assembly of men, the Batu Mauda was the assembly of 40 men that were tasked with governing this caliphate of Hamdallah that takes power and sort of like imposes its power throughout that region over Hamdallah, Djenné, part of Timbuktu, from the 1818 through the 1860s. So at this point, let's weave back together the three strands that we've laid out. So in the age of Hamdallah dominion in that region of the Sahel, the leaders of Hamdallah unleashed a reconfiguration of political power, religious legitimacy, and slavery through a racialized Islamic discourse. And so this was the world that Abu Bakr Siddiq Ouattara, a Black man who had spent 30 years enslaved in Jamaica, and who was in the process of undertaking a transatlantic and now trans-Saharan journey to return home as a free man. This is the world that he was seeking to get back into. So this was his home, sure, but it was also a home that was very foreign to whatever he had left behind as a teenager when he had been kidnapped. And so I guess a question to ask is, could the news of ongoing momentous socio-political change in the caliphate, and in Hamdallah, in Djenné, in Timbuktu, could these particular news have reached Ouattara in Guelmim? We can't know that for sure, but what we do know strongly suggests that while in Guelmim, Ouattara did manage to keep himself informed and apprised of some of the changes that were sweeping the home region, perhaps not the specific changes that were enforced in the Tarikh al-Fatash, in the Chronicle, but at least some of the changes that were sweeping the region, and he adapted his strategy accordingly. So what allows me to say that? Well, Guelmim, that town in the south of Morocco where he stayed, was a caravan town par excellence. It was a trans-Saharan information hub and a key stop on the cultural highway, funneling news, stories, and rumors across West and North Africa, and even across the Mediterranean and the Sahel. Ghislaine Leiden writes that caravans, quote, supplied much more than provisions, merchandise, and enslaved laborers. They opened trans-Saharan lines of communication, bringing stories of faraway places and news about distant relatives, political events, and the latest fashions, end of quote. And so in the half year that he spent in Guelmim and in other parts of the Maghreb, you see that Ouattara keeps receiving information about what's going on in the Sahel, in the places that he's trying to reach, in Djenné, in Timbuktu, in Bouna, in Kong, in Northern Côte d'Ivoire. So for example, in March, while they were in Marrakesh, Ouattara and Davidson, quote, received the names of current Fulani, Hausa, and Bamana rulers, end of quote. Later on, when they were in the south, later that spring, a traveler coming back from Timbuktu told them about ongoing battles between Hamdallah forces and Tuareg clans. 4 days later, a caravan brought reports of a battle in which the Bamana had defeated the Fulani, and they also brought news about a problem with failed crops, both developments having allegedly triggered large population displacements. These are just two of many examples extracted from Davidson's journal, which reflect the kind of news that, that Davidson and by extension Ouattara would have been privy to and interested in. But in addition to that, it is likely that Ouattara had access to a type of information that Davidson didn't, namely through Black information networks. Indeed, unlike Davidson, Ouattara was constantly in touch with West Africa, whether free and enslaved, in his time in Morocco, in the Maghreb. And Ouattara's embeddedness within a variety of Black networks in the Maghreb might have provided him with additional opportunities to gather news and information pertinent to his freedom project. So for example, we know that in January in Rabat, people that Davidson described as Ouattara's countrymen visited him. We don't know the content of the conversation. Likewise, some of the soldiers that formed part of their escort, the escort that the expedition obtained, were also Ouattara's countrymen, and they had specific interactions with him. In February in Marrakesh, Ouattara had 3 different meetings with the chief eunuch, who given his function was likely a West African who had been captured as a child. And in Guelmim, Ouattara was constantly frequenting the market, a place humming with encounters, discussions, and exchanges. He met West Africans who had been recently enslaved and forced to cross the desert, including some from Kong, who informed him that one of his relatives and former classmates was now the ruler of Kong. And so Kong is an area that part of Ouattara's family was from, as he says in his autobiography, that is located is in what is now the north of Côte d'Ivoire. These kind of interactions between Ouattara and people from his own region are difficult to trace, because we only know about them, not from Ouattara directly, but from what Davidson, the English traveler that he journeys with, is able to get a glimpse of. So we can imagine that they were plentiful. We can imagine that in these discussions, a lot of news would have been exchanged about the state of affairs in the Sahel, where he was trying to get back. And so in the densely interwoven world of the 19th century Western Sahel and the Sahara, which was swarming with caravans carrying travelers, couriers, traders, refugees, or enslaved women and men, these people all acting as vessels for tales of revolution, insurgencies, war, and societal change. In this world, the Hamdallahi statement, seeking to spread propaganda, tapped into these networks to fan a common wind, channeling news of a new social order and political order. So we cannot ascertain whether Ouattara learned about the specific language of racial slavery that the Hamdallahi leadership actively sought to spread. However, we can be sure that through fleeting interactions, shared conversations, prayers, or rituals with other West Africans in Morocco and Guelmim, and interactions with elite circles as well, he would have acquired a more refined and textured sense of the magnitude of social political change that was underway in his region. We know for sure that he did, because, for example, at some point he changes part of his story and his claims of lineages, and starts explaining to Davidson that he is in fact the cousin of Amadou Lobo, the man who is the ruler of this new caliphate of Hamdallahi, which is very different from the kind of claims he had made about his kinship and his family back when he was in Jamaica, and writing his autobiography. So he's certainly adapting his strategy as he gleans information and news along the way. So what implications did these information networks, and I'm sorry, I forgot once of them to show a map, that is a map of the main markets and caravan routes of the Wadnoon trade network, but that also shows some of the routes through which news and information would have traveled, right? Traveled along these caravans. And this spot here very roughly represents where Hamdallahi would be located. So what implications did all of these information that he was trying to gather have for his project to remain free and to return home? 3 conclusions or semi-conclusions emerge at this point. The first one is that although Ouattara's certificate of release from apprenticeship in Jamaica declared him, quote, absolutely and utterly free, end of quote, despite this mention, it's very obvious from the beginning that his freedom remained very much fraught and tentative, not just in Jamaica, but also particularly in the racialized world of the 19th century Sahara. And so if Ouattara wanted to remain secure, he needed to leave the Maghreb. Because there, despite being Muslim and thus having some degree of nominal protection from enslavement, being racialized as Black effectively rendered him vulnerable. Moreover, even if he were to escape re-enslavement, living in the bustling caravan town of Gelmim and bearing witness daily to racial slavery against Black people might have become too painful a reminder of the trauma and violence of his own enslavement. Second, having grasped the range of social political change ongoing in his home region, Ouattara might have calculated that despite Hamdallah's new political order, he himself did not incur significant risk of enslavement by returning there. Indeed, giving his belongings to an established and recognized and old West African Muslim lineage and to elite family circles, which we didn't really go over, but we could do more of in the Q&A. The new Hamdallahi social order would not have posed, I believe, a significant risk of enslavement to him, as it did to members of the other communities targeted in the Forged Chronicle, for example, or other more vulnerable populations in West Africa who are absolutely being enslaved. Third, despite being relatively safe from enslavement in the Sahel, if he were to reach it, what could have constituted a significant liability for Ouattara vis-a-vis the Hamdallahi authorities was his close association with Davidson, a white Christian. To paint a wider picture of why this was a risk, by 1836, the year that they're trying to cross the Sahara, only 2 white Christians had been able to reach Timbuktu. The first one was a Scottish military man, Gordon Laing, in 1826, who did not make it out alive, or he didn't manage to get back to Europe alive. He died in the Sahara when he attempted to go back. And the second one was a French traveler, René Caillé, in 1828. Gordon Laing, in one of the last letters that he sent before dying in the Sahara in 1826, he wrote to the British consul in Tripoli, and he said, quote, "My situation in Timbuktu has been rendered exceedingly unsafe by the unfriendly disposition of the Fulani of Masina." So that's the people from the Caliphate that we're just discussing, who have this year upset the dominion of the Tuareg and made themselves patrons of Timbuktu, and whose Sultan has expressed his hostility towards me in no equivocal terms. End of quote. And so Laing here is referring to the Hamdallahi leader, Amadou Lobo. And so while Amadou Lobo's general sentiment towards Christian travelers and diplomats cannot be inferred solely from Laing's impression, certainly it remained like a poor precedent for Davidson, right? And by extension for Ouattara, who was already trying to get back to the region in, circumstances that were not the safest. It was probably a big liability to show up with this traveler, having claimed that he was the cousin of nobility, of the rulers, etc. It was probably risky for him to show up with Davidson. And so all in all, the dangers of enslavement in Morocco, the appealing perspective of settling in a land ruled by other West African Muslims, yet the risk of making an unfavorable impression upon the Hamdallahi leadership because of Davidson might explain why, towards the end of their stay in Gelmin, Ouattara appeared, quote, half anxious and half afraid to proceed, end of quote. In contrast, Davidson's resolve to reach Timbuktu was unwavering. And by year's end, the expedition decided to depart Gelmim. On December 18th, 1836, shortly after they had left Wandoun, their caravan was attacked and Davidson killed. Ouattara's fate remained unknown, though by the estimates of the British Council in Morocco, he would likely have been either killed or enslaved in the Sahara. However, in a subsequent letter to the council, Sheikh Barouk, who had been their host in Gelmim, wrote that some oral reports had reached him, alleging that Ouattara had been able to, in fact, carry on the trip. He had survived the attack, carried on the trip with the remainder of the caravan, and indeed returned home. We can't know for sure if that's true, but one last piece of information. 5 years later, in January 1841, Queen Victoria named a special commissioner for inquiry into the British settlements on the west coast of Africa. And so that person, that special commissioner, was to lead an investigation into the slave trading activities of British merchants on the West African coast. And so the person that the Queen appointed was named Richard Robert Madden. Do you remember him? He was the judge that had signed off on Ouattara's freedom certificate in Jamaica and arranged for his travels to London. And so while he was in the Gold Coast, Madden sought to find out whether Ouattara had survived the attack or not. He dispatched leaflets throughout West Africa, offering monetary rewards in exchange for information about him. In June, a caravan reached Mogador from Timbuktu. One of the travelers approached the British vice consul in Morocco, introducing himself as a friend of Ouattara. And he reported that indeed Abubakar Siddiq Ouattara had successfully returned to his hometown of Djenné. Some 35 years had passed since his abduction. So I'll end there. Thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to questions, comments, suggestions. And there's a lot that we haven't covered in this talk, particularly the actual contents of Ouattara's autobiography or his life in Jamaica. So I'll be happy to do that, to talk about that a little bit in the Q&A as well. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Madina. That was a real treat, really fascinating research, and you have a great turnout here, by the way. And so I'm sure there are plenty of questions from the audience. Let me just open up with one question, and then we'll turn it over to colleagues on the Zoom. I wonder if you could you had mentioned this talk or this research as a chapter from your dissertation.
Yes.
I wonder if you could situate this discussion, in the broader kind of dissertation, the broader intellectual agenda, which I assume will eventually be a book. Could you just kind of insert this into your broader research agenda? Thanks.
Right. Yes, I'm hoping it will eventually be a book. For now, I'm just trying to get through this dissertation. So essentially, in the project, in the bigger project, and this is the first part. This is the earlier kind of stories that I'm looking at. I try to use the stories of people I call travelers, itinerant Muslims, and they're specific from the Sahel, and their specific quests for freedom, which usually they enacted through mobility, and they enacted through reliance on, trans-Sahelian community networks to kind of show the impact of various kinds of oppression systems that impacted populations in the region in the 19th and 20th century. So Abubakar Siddiq Ouattara is the first one that I cover, because when I first encountered his story in the beginning of graduate school, it's a very striking story, right? It's not the first, it's not the first or the only story. Like we see a lot of these other stories emerging nowadays of, enslaved Black Muslims in the Americas and discussions around them, rightfully so, but I myself had a focus on Mali, and in Mali, unlike some other territories, let's say unlike Ghana or Senegal, for example, I think we tend to think of our national history as a lot more separated from a lot of these Atlantic dynamics, including the transatlantic slave trade. There's not necessarily this connection that's readily made, and so that's why I was very struck by this. But after this, of course, and after this story, I open it up, and jump to later time periods. Well, more or less at the same time as this was happening, in the early 19th century, as this emancipation was underway in the British Atlantic, for example, France was going bankrupt, had lost territories in Louisiana and Saint-Domingue, and they started to turn to West Africa. They intensified their territorial expansion in West Africa. And as we know, by the early 20th century, there's French colonization. At the same time as this is happening, particularly in the place that I'm interested in what is today Mali, you have this dual process of French colonization and French abolition of local processes of enslavement that were very big in the region at the time, and that were impacted a lot of people. So I tried to examine some of that, and there's a lot of great work that's been done on this particular time period of the French, quote, abolition of slavery. That was also, a process by which they were able to derive forced labor and other things from these populations. But I look at these internal processes of slavery as well, and how people try to get free, then look at specific decolonial struggles. So in general, it's just a succession of micro histories through which I look at bigger processes through which people try to get free from systems of slavery, various systems, and colonization.
Great, thank you so much. Jim McCann, please go ahead.
Wow, thank you. My goodness. I have two quick questions for you that you really upset a lot of my teaching. One is when you talked about his original enslavement, he was kidnapped.
Mm-hmm.
You used the passive voice. He was kidnapped by, who kidnapped him?
He was kidnapped. So he's kidnapped. There is a conflict. He's kidnapped while he's studying in Buna, where he's undergoing his schooling and his training. There is a conflict between two policies, Buna and Bondunku. In the course of this conflict, a number of people are killed in Buna, and he is came back by these people from Bondunku who attacked the town. He's then sold, and that part is a bit tricky because all we know about that is what he talks about in his autobiography. And his autobiography, he's actually very cryptic about the actual circumstances of his enslavement, just both in West Africa, but also in Jamaica. So he said, oh, I was taken. He uses also the passive voice a lot. We were taken, we were brought, he's brought to the Gold Coast. There he's sold to British slavers, and then he's taken over. But I remain vague because he himself, the only source we have for that so far is what he wrote. And in his autobiography, he's actually very deliberate about not talking so much about his enslavement, not talking so much about the bad things that happened to him. I think it was a strategy. He mostly tries to highlight and talk about his education, the noble lineage that he was from. Essentially, I think strategies that kind of are perhaps more likely to trigger, if not empathy, at least some degree of, what am I trying to say? Yeah, some degree of empathy from his readers who might consider him a bit more of a peer. I hope I'm making sense.
Well, that's a great response, because a passive voice is a very dangerous thing because it obscures things. The other question I have is quickly, I have my copy of Ajayi and Crowther here with John Hunwick citing the Tariq al-Fatash. I use it, I just used last week in my teaching as though this, you're suggesting the original document was in fact a forgery, or this version was a forgery?
So I'm not
my entire lecture of this period.
So I'm not the one to blame. Other scholars are to blame, and so I will gladly redirect you to them. So the Tariq al-Fatash has been known to be, at least significant portions of it, to be forgeries for a while. I think even Hunwick, I mean, Hunwick, wrote a bunch about it and sort of like reassessed, refined his assessment of it. Yeah. But so it wasn't just Hunwick, right? Like Madina Thiam, Bintu Sanankwa, other scholars wrote about this. So yes, parts of the Tariq al-Fatash were definitely forged. It was not necessarily even the most subtle forgery. And this is something that you can read about, in English just last year, 2020, Mauro Nobili published a monograph that's a big reassessment of, one, the Tariq al-Fatash, two, the role that it played in the construction of that polity, that 19th century polity that I was discussing. So
a forgery with a purpose.
It's a forgery with a purpose, yes. It's a forgery because it says, the author, claiming to be again from the 19th century, says, listen, this great man is about to appear, in a few centuries, and he will create this great polity. And he is the heir of all the other great men that you know about, and we should all follow him. So I don't even think it was the most subtle forgery in that sense. But I think, as I mentioned briefly, I think there's Mauro Nobili's book from last year, but importantly, there will be that new critical translation and edition of the Tariq al-Fatash that probably is going to help us reassess a lot of these. But so not all parts of it are forged. I think definitely enough of it is also indeed from when it claims to be from. So I hope I didn't entirely upset you.
Well, you've changed my lecture. You haven't upset me. It's information. Thank you so much. Terrific.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I think we have 3 in our queue right now. So Tim Weiskell, I think you've put a question in the chat. I wonder if you could verbalize that for us.
Well, I have several questions, and this fantastic work to start with. I'm really quite
Thank you.
swept away by it. I think this has got to be examined from the full range of Arabic texts that were brought to light by people who were studying Buna and Bondoku at the time the French penetrated from the south. You might recall there was a bit of a rivalry with the French and the English along the coast, as it were, to try to get to the interior. And one of the things they did was try to keep track of what was going on in Bondoku and Kong in particular. And I just wondered if you had a lot of sources or any sources on the Muslim community in Kong.
So that's indeed, as you said, I think like there's a lot more that needs to be done there. And that's the part where I myself haven't focused as thoroughly as I would have wanted. There is this book, I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's by George Kojo, and maybe I can put the reference in the chat.
That'd be great if you could. Yeah,
later. Yeah, it's on the Kingdom of Kong from the origins to the end of the 19th century. And he does go over a lot of the sources that were available, written and oral sources,
okay.
To kind of give an overview of, and he does actually mention briefly Abu Bakr, and more importantly, his father, in this book. So I will leave the reference. It's by George Nyamke Kojo. There's also not, I seemingly keep discovering more works by Ivor Wilkes. I don't know if this will ever end. There's an endless succession of it. But I think this is a story that he's been quite interested in, that he worked on probably on and off, but for many decades. I even found a footnote. Actually, I didn't find it. It was pointed out to me by Coleman Donaldson, but there's a footnote in one of his works where he is saying that he was working, unfortunately it was before he passed away, on a full biography of Abu Bakr Siddiq that would correct a lot of the mistakes that he said he did in his previous interpretations of it. And of course, unfortunately, Ivor Wilkes passed away, but so that's also something that I haven't had a chance to do that probably would be a good thing to do, is to look into his archives or to look into what might be available there, and but also in what he's published. Like in several of the other books, you will have things that touch Kong here and there, in his works on Gonja, in his works on Wa. So Ivor Wilkes for me has also been like really an endless source of discovery for that history of Kong. As well as, and I will also drop the reference, there is this book, which is a report of a conference that happened in Kong in 1977. That gathered, both academic scholars, but also scholars of oral traditions, including griot, who went over a lot of these oral and I believe perhaps also written traditions in Kong. So I think there are sources there, and there's indeed, as you say, a lot of work to be done to like fully lay out, the full reach of this story and what happens before, right? We focused on what happens after, but there's a lot that happens before. That's very interesting there.
Well, and some of it's been collected from the early sources by the early colonial administrators. Maurice Delafosse made a big collection of Arabic material that his daughter held for years and years and years. I think it ended up in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris because she was negotiating with them to purchase the Arab manuscripts that he had in his own possession when he retired. But basically, he was a key figure in the emergence of early French Africanist studies at the École des Langues Orientales in Paris. And he knew the value of these Arabic sources, even if he didn't read Arabic himself. So he took care to preserve them, but I don't know where they've ended up. I think Catherine Kokuri-Vidrovich in Paris at the École des Hautes Études would know and would be able to put you right onto those materials and to the whole group of people studying them, because there was a group around Emmanuel Terret who was looking at the ethnographic implications of the Buna Bondoku connections. It also shows up in the, and I love your use of maps, because I'm interested in them at this point, and we're beginning to trace some of the maps of West Africa during this period made by Europeans on the basis of hearsay down on the coast. And they have elaborate detail about Kong, which nobody has ever been to. They invent a whole chain of mountains called the Mountains of Kong, which sort of show up in the middle of the 19th century, don't exist, but I mean, they show up on these maps. But what's more interesting is a whole series of maps that have the time measurements of how long it takes to go from place to place. They're kind of, they're not detailed itinerary maps, but they're indications of how many days it takes to walk from here to there. And there are several that connect Kumasi straight to Kong and to Bonoa and Bondoku. So these might be of interest in reestablishing the links as you referred to them in the Sahara. But there are also links further on down in what Wilkes used to call the northern factor in Ashanti history.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you. And I think these maps and also these itinerary that you talk about of showing how people are walking and how long it takes them really show, I don't know, I feel like colonial borders have really done a trick on a lot of us in separating places that were very much connected. And Dave is here, can talk about it a lot, but it really shows the deep interconnections between a lot of these spaces that, you know, we don't readily think about as being connected nowadays.
I'll put a link to the key one we've been studying in the map circle, and you'll get it from the link in the references here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. David, you're up next, and then Falou.
Hi, Madina. First of all, thank you for a really fascinating presentation. I feel like I have a lot of questions, so I'm just going to stick to a couple here. So you talked about mobility as being really key to freedom. And as you know, I agree with you on this question, but there's a flip side of this, right? Is that there is immobility in a lot of ways. And so I was curious about in what ways are states or sort of social hierarchies trying to restrict mobility to avoid this sort of freedom seeking that you're discussing? And the second question, which is sort of related to that, and you can answer either of them if you don't need to answer both of them, is in terms of using mobility, as a way of freedom seeking, people have to go somewhere else, right? So when they arrive in these new locations, how are they welcomed? Are there sort of new social dynamics to balance? Are these things that are done through, people have linguistic skills and they're settling in communities where they know the languages already? How do those sorts of dynamics take place? If you know, I know that the further back in time you go, the harder it is to reconstruct certain sorts of social dynamics. So if you don't know, that's totally fine.
Yeah, those are great questions. For the most part, I don't know. We'll have to talk more, Dave. But I guess, so okay, immobility. I guess I've been trying to focus in these, because I've adopted the micro-historical approach, and sort of like going like bottom up and seeing how people are navigating these, these partitions. I feel like I don't have enough of a good understanding of the way states, especially these pre-colonial entities, actively restrict the mobilities of some people beyond, what the kind of conventional things that we can expect, right? Enslavement, there's probably very gendered dynamics at play there. This chapter that I presented on, and most of the sources around Ouattara are very centered on men. He never even mentions, for example, we don't know if he had a family in Jamaica, or if he went, it appears he left by himself to return to the Sahara and the Sahel. But we know a lot of, but he never even mentions, and he stays very silent also on his kinship in general after he's being enslaved. So, but necessarily there had to have been women there. There's a lots of mentions of enslaved women, when they are in Gelmim, in that part of the Sahara. So you see this mobility happening, but I'm not sure, to go back to your question, sorry. I don't know enough, so I don't want to say, I don't want to say too much about what I don't know, in what specific ways mobility is being restricted. But I would imagine that it was running along, you know, social lines, like lines of class and enslavement and whatnot, and also gender. When you move into the later period, I'm sure you've read, so Marie Rodet in her work, for example, she shows how into the colonial era, a lot of West African women actually sees labor mobility as a way of escaping enslavement, local forms of enslavement, or escaping, you know, matrimony if they did not want it, and things like that. So I'm sure there were a lot of strategies that were, you know, that occurred in this way. But they're difficult to trace, as you say. So that's a good question. I should be more attentive to that, like how people are being immobilized specifically. Yeah, we should talk more about it. We should do a call and just.
It's a very difficult question, and it's something I'm struggling with myself, which is partially why I asked. I wasn't sure if you had a better window on it than I.
Great, thanks. Falou, please go ahead.
Madina, thank you very much for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Very informative. I want to ask you one question on sources, and see. We know the literacy issue is complex, and we learned from Wilk of Abu Bakr keeping records of the plantation in English Ajami, using the Arabic script to document, you know, expenses of his master. So that raises a different, you know, different sets of questions. And that is the multiple literacies of Africans. And these Africans speak Arabic, or they read and write Arabic, but they also read and write their own languages. And in an English context, they write English using the Arabic script. So could you tell us more about these kind of profiles, the profiles of these, you know, multilingual, multiliterate Africans? And have you found others beyond Abu Bakr Siddiqui with that complexity, you know, that multi forms of literacies?
Yes, absolutely. That's a key question. First, I have to thank Professor Ngom, because you stopped very briefly at UCLA. I don't remember if it was like 3 or 4 years ago, for a presentation, and it was a quick conversation, but that with you, that really encouraged me to keep researching this. So I'm grateful for that. Absolutely, it's so key what you're discussing, that question of literacy, multiple literacies, and multiple languages. We're talking about people in the case of Abu Bakr who are able to weave back and forth, to go back and forth between multiple languages so quickly, right? What comes up in his autobiography. So the story is that he wrote the autobiography in Arabic, in the Arabic language, at the request of the Irish judge who had in a previous life been, you know, he traveled around Syria and Palestine, and he fancied himself to be, you know, to know Arabic well. So Abu Bakr Siddiq writes the manuscript in Arabic, then performs an oral translation of that writing that he just did from Arabic to English, and Madden writes that down, and that's the manuscript that we have today in English. We do not have the original Arabic manuscript that Abu Bakr himself wrote. The only actual trace of his writing, like handwriting, that we have is what we see on this this freedom certificate that he signs. So that's one first thing. So he wrote the Arabic language in the Arabic script. As you said, we know that he also wrote English Ajami, so Jamaican English in the Arabic script. We know it because he mentions it, and the man who enslaved him mentioned it. He was known to be an overseer, sorry, not overseer, a bookkeeper, and keep the records of the day, accounting records in English, but written in the Arabic script. Those are also sources that I've tried to find, during research in Jamaica, also in Ireland, in the papers of the judge. Haven't been able to so far, but we do have one example of a similar document that was written in English Ajami, not from Abu Bakr, but from the other man who he was corresponding with in Jamaica. It's a very recent discovery, actually. I will drop it. I don't know if you had a chance to see this paper, but Abu Bakr was corresponding with another man named Muhammad Kaba Saranugo, who was enslaved in Jamaica, who was older than him, but enslaved in Jamaica around the same time as he was. And we knew that Muhammad Kaba was literate because we have an example of an Arabic language manuscript that he wrote in Arabic. But recently, actually, two scholars have, let me find, okay, so Elizabeth Dulin and Ahmed Irisi Alami, I think they found a manuscript in Northern Ireland in the papers of a colonial administrator that show a speech that Muhammad Kaba wrote at the occasion of the end of apprenticeship, so the full abolition of slavery in Jamaica. There's a numbers of ceremonies that are organized with the enslaved, the formerly enslaved, and with British official. And he writes a speech, and it is in this English Ajami, and there is actually the text there.
That's interesting.
No, it's, yeah, I think you'll be very interested. I mean, because you obviously you're the specialist of that, so you really see the devices he employs to, sorry, not translate, but transcribe these English words into Ajami, into the Arabic script. And then we don't know for sure, but he probably read the speech aloud. And so far that particular document was not, people did not know about it. And the scholars who found it, I mean, they published this article in 2019, so it's very recent. So I'm sure if we mine more archives in England, Ireland, wherever these colonial administrators ended up, there's probably a lot more such text that we can find. In English Ajami, but also other languages Ajami as well, that were produced by these enslaved people in the Caribbean. So there are some examples. I'm talking about a lot of references that I should drop, but I will put it in the chat. But that's at least one example of it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Ghana, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madina, for a great talk. I really enjoyed it. I have just one question, and could you say a bit more about the racial ideology that was circulating in Hamdallah when Ouattara was returning, and their origin, right? Is it something that is locally constructed? How does it connect to the French colonial ideology of la théorie des races, which sort of also kind of elevated the Fulani above other sub-Saharan Africans? Is it connected to some also ideologies of race that circulated within the midst of Khan, for example, those kind of things, right? And when Abu Bakr returns, does he sort of embrace that as he reconstructs his kinship, or he sort of distances himself from these racial hierarchies? He who has been already enslaved, right?
Yeah.
Where does he fit in this picture? Thank you.
Yeah, that's the more difficult question that I feel like I'm grappling with throughout the dissertation. You have a lot of overlapping systems of slavery and of notions of race that interact in the Sahel. And it can become very difficult to kind of entangle which one is one person referring to at the time, at a specific juncture, and for what purpose. So, okay, so when Ouattara returns, if he did return, that's the part that I myself not sure about. We have reports from the time saying that he did, but I have not done the research, maybe in Jene or like other places to know if locally there are sources that corroborate like indeed that which surely there would be, I think, if he was indeed able to return to his family. So I'm not sure about that. And if he did, I'm also not sure where he would have been situated within these various ideologies. And that's what I find particularly interesting about this character, right? Because is that he had to navigate Atlantic and British notions of race and race making, and who is Black and who is not, and who can be enslaved and who is not. And then you arrive in the Maghreb, and there's the same questions are being posed, but with different answers. And then in the Sahel, same thing, perhaps to a lesser extent, these discourses around race, but they're still certainly present, at least in Islamic discourse in the Sahel. And that's, Bruce Hall has done the most work on this in his history of race in West Africa, where he really sees how scholars, politicians like the Hamdani leadership and other people use these rhetorical devices to talk about Blackness in a way that signifies enslavement. But that's where it becomes very complicated, because they themselves are racialized as Black, right, by other Muslims who are present in the region at the time. And so, sorry, the very short answer to your question is, I'm not sure. I think that's, and because it's very messy, because at the same time, you have multiple systems that are overlapping. And I don't think there's necessarily that's what makes the region so interesting to me, is that in the 19th century and then in the 20th century, what you mentioned is French ideologies of race that will add themselves onto that in an even more forceful manner. All of this interacts and kind of shapes how people think about not just race, but also class, right? Who can be enslaved and who cannot. So really the answer to your question is, I'm not sure, but that's why I find it so fascinating, is that you have all these systems and people using the same rhetoric to talk about very different stuff in the region at the time. So that makes it very tricky to decipher, but that makes it all the more interesting. I think language is also one big aspect of it. That's the last thing, is that, and maybe I didn't do a good job in the presentation today of showing that, but these things are occurring in many different languages, right? And so even references to Blackness, to race, you have mentions in Arabic, you have mentions in Songhai, you have all kinds of mentions. So I don't think, I think that adds yet another layer of complexity to it. One last thing though, there is an anecdote from Hamdallah about, and that's something that's found in the oral traditions that Amadou Hampâté-Bâ writes about later on, about how some people, Hamdallah, the way they came to power, it was a big revolution. Indeed, a revolution in the sense of upsetting the previous social order. But it was not a full revolution. And so I think there's an anecdote about how the councilmen of the councilmen of the Hamdallah parliament, or however you called it, the Batumardo, who were these 40 men entrusted with making decisions for the caliphate. One day, as the oral tradition goes, following the Quranic tenet whereby all believers are brothers, they had petitioned to abolish caste. The next day, Amadou Lobo had his cooks stew lizards, frogs, fish, chicken, and mutton together, and presented the stunned councilmen with the dish. As he invited them to dig in, they hollered, "Why would you want us to eat this?" Amadou Lobo answers, "Well, does the Quran forbid the consumption of any of these meats?" And the councilmen said, "No, of course, but even though we're allowed to eat these meats, just the thought of mixing lizards and frogs and whatever and fish together, it's pretty disgusting. We're not going to do that." And Amadou Lobo answers, "Well, as with these meats, even though the book doesn't forbid it, the thought of mixing noble people and caste people, or abolishing the barriers we have erecting among them to separate them, is disgusting to me." And of course, according to Hampâté-Bâ, of course, that's oral tradition that he writes about. And so thus continued the distinction between free people, caste people, enslaved people, etc. So even though here you don't have reference to race, but you have very clear reference to, caste and the enforcement of these separations for various purposes. So that, and Hampâté-Bâ writes about this in French when he reports it. Obviously, this would have been in Fulani, in Fulfulde. So all to say, I think there's a lot of different dynamics occurring at the same time, and people, again, using similar rhetorics, but to talk about different stuff.
Okay, so so I think there's a question for you in the chat. It was actually a direct message to me, so
Oh, okay.
I perhaps that's a signal that they want to remain anonymous. I'm not sure, but I'll err on the side of caution. So the question is, great presentation, thanks. Question: could you say a bit more about what's contained in the archives in Jamaica? Are there other related documents? Thank you.
Yeah, I have not spent as much time in Jamaica as I would have wanted to, unfortunately, so I'll need to keep doing research there. I haven't found other Arabic manuscripts, but it was a short period when that I spent in the archives there, in the National Archives and the National Library, and I suspect that was probably not the best place to look. If such manuscripts are to be found, which I'm surely, as we were saying before, I think there are many more, I think at least several of them would probably be not in Jamaica proper, but actually back in the UK and in Ireland, where a lot of these administrators who seized these documents or had them for whatever reason, went back. The Archives of the Royal Geographical Society of London, where we know that, Ouattara tried to work with them in order to be sent as a guide back to Timbuktu. We know that they received a copy of his manuscript at some point. Now it seems nobody knows where the original Arabic manuscript is, but I'm sure that would be a great place to look. So all these kinds of places, I think, probably are very likely, in addition to Jamaica, to hold some of these Arabic documents. But otherwise in Jamaica, what you do have, though, that I think is also really important to help reconstruct not just this story, but other stories of enslaved people is, first of all, a lot like this small portion of manumission certificate that I saw. It's contained in these very large, huge books full of such certificates. You have a lot of property records, some of which now I think are online, are accessible online through the British Library or other British Archive, but a lot of property records from the various parishes of Jamaica. The parishes are the administrative divisions of the island that kind of show, what was going on some of the plantations, who was being sold, where, etc. And so through that, you could trace a lot of these stories. And then what else? Yeah, just the full range of, what you might find is, the slavery was very brutal and very long system in Jamaica. So I think if not particularly things pertaining to Muslim literacy, you can find a lot of ways to sort of get a better understanding of what their lives might have been like. And of course, there's still a lot missing, right? So for example, there was a big slave revolt that took place while Ouattara was in Jamaica during his time. We don't know whether or not he participated in it or did not, and collaborated with the British planter caste. We don't know much about it, but we know that in 1831, 1832, there was this very large, the Baptist War, this very large rebellion that affected a lot of people. We know, for example, that Mohammed Kaba, the other man that he corresponds with, claims to have not participated in the rebellion. Of course, he didn't want to be killed if there was evidence of him having participated. But we know, for example, that he says that his wife burned and destroyed some Arabic document that he held at the time because she didn't want it to be found in the aftermath, in the massive repression that took place after the rebellion to punish the leaders. So there's probably, I think, long answer again. There's probably a lot more in the Jamaican archive, certainly, that needs to be researched, and that will help us understand these stories a bit better.
Great, thanks. So I am not seeing any other comments in the chat or any raised hands. So if there's, maybe I'll just wait. Okay, Tim, you just raised your hand. Go ahead.
Oh, we can't, you're muted.
I'm sorry, very sorry. You mentioned in one of your rich comments that these things have implications right down to the present day. And in fact, they do in the Ivory Coast in an enormous way, because the links between the northern parts of the country and the southern part of the country are terribly wrapped up in this whole history of the enslavement of various populations. And in fact, it was one of the major sources that led to the Civil War. If you may recall recently, between the North and South, the whole notion of who was an enslaved population was abruptly transformed, in a sense, in the 19th century, when Europe decided it didn't want to export slaves anymore. And yet there were whole circuits of slave trading and movement from northern regions to the south of slaves who were quickly absorbed in the cash cropping economies as a subordinate labor force, basically the cocoa and coffee that get going. So much so that the continuation of slavery in Ivory Coast cocoa is now a big issue. It's usually referred to as childhood slavery, and it's a matter of some international anxiety and reprobation of Nestle's in particular. But these things have their roots back in this period, and some of it's well documented in the early colonial archives as well. So it seems to me that, yes, not only are there implications these days, but they extend and expand in a sense, and they expand in their importance in ways that we haven't really fully documented or grasped, I'm afraid. In any case,
certainly.
thank you so much.
Thank you.
For your
No,
insight.
I was just going to add that's certainly also the case in Mali, where, with the current conflict is often framed exclusively in terms of, ideology, Islamic ideology, political struggles and whatnot. But I think a very significant aspect that some researchers have been working on, and that's great, are these social issues that have ramifications, very old ramifications of class, of enslavement, and that's surely something that continues to affect our societies a lot, indeed.
Great, thanks, Madina. Well, I think you can see from the responses in the chat, I think people were blown away by the presentation and really enjoyed it. And so I think we all owe you a digital round of applause. So thank you very much for joining us and sharing your research with us. And we wish you well. Hope we can keep in touch.
All right. Thanks a lot again thank you everyone for showing up. I really enjoyed the discussion as well. And thank you for the invitation again to Mike and Eric.